found the market to be, with interest rates, being a bit higher, and obviously you mentioned one key point, which, is from cash flow. How has the market really been affected recently? I mean, have you seen less deals just because of the difficulty in, financing, maybe some of the financing cost? And then I think you obviously, for folks listening, and I think Rick highlighted a really important point, just cash flow, because you're not going to be able to get, as he mentioned, anywhere from 70 to 90% upfront that you may be getting from an outright sale. So you have to be able to have that actual cash flow in the business. So maybe walk us through some of your experiences more recently, just in the more challenging interest rate environment, and how it's really affected deals, if at all.
Well, first of all, Carl, you don't need me on this call because you're so damn smart. You're the one that can answer all these questions because you sort of led right into it. I'm going to start at the end of the discussion or into the question and work backwards. As far as the the number of transactions that are taking place, we've seen a dramatic reduction in M&A deals, meaning private equity and strategic acquisitions, starting to pick up a little bit more now. But for the last 2.5 to 3 years, that industry has really collapsed. Partly because if you think about it, most private equity firms are financing the acquisition, and as interest rates now are growing, and during the height of COVID, with both supply chain issues and employment issues with people coming, not working out of the offices, and companies being highly damaged in many industries from the downturn that did take place. There was a question of whether firms wanted to step up and take on that risk to do acquisitions. So there was a lot of reduction in that world. The opposite is in the ESOP world. Even though interest rates now, we've seen 625 basis point increases off the low, just over a 16-month period of time, which is unprecedented in the industry, in society from a financial perspective. Even though you would think that since this is a leveraged buyout, it would have a negative effect on being able to do ESOP transactions or some type of leveraged buyout, it's actually had the opposite effects. And I think it's because you get back to the fundamental premise and the philosophy behind why owners look at doing ESOPs over the other strategies. Again, most of the owners we work with, although they want to be treated fairly through the transaction, they're more focused on making sure the business is perpetuated, their employees are protected and rewarded, and the company has the capability of continuing to grow and survive and succeed into the future, partly because they're going to benefit from that success. More importantly, so they can protect it. And so as interest rates have gone up that have affected the cash flow, what in essence has happened is, when I talked about that prior example, 3 times EBITDA banks can legally lend. Because of that, the push on cash flow or the restriction on cash flow at a higher interest rate, what we find most owners have been willing to accept, and banks have almost forced this issue anyway, is instead of loaning all the way up to the 3 times of EBITDA, owners are willing to take a much lower cash out up front, and banks are loaning maybe 1.5 to 2 times. The rest is now a lower interest rate seller note. And so when you're taking that seller note and it's subordinated, it's an interest only note behind the bank. When you're taking less principal up front from the bank, you're actually at the same level of cash flow payments at the lower dollar amount, but even at a higher interest rate than we were even 16 months ago, when we were able to borrow money on these transactions at only 2.5 to 2.75% interest, whereas today we're seeing between 6.9 and 7.5% interest on the bank note. So we have not seen a downturn, as the opposite. We've had, as a firm, and I think the industry would be consistent with us, which is we've had 3 back-to-back record years, both in the number of transactions we've done, along with the overall size of the companies that we've been able to assist in implementing ESOP. So we have not seen it negatively affected because of interest rates climbing. Although I think now that interest rates most likely will stabilize, and then potentially 12 to 15 to 18 months going out, when you look at it, we could have some interest rate reductions. Although, again, I'm not an economist, although that's my background. I look and I try to read as much as I can about what's going on economically from a macro perspective. I think we're going to have longer term inflation at a little bit higher than what the Federal Reserve is looking to push to, which is 2%. I'm more in the thought process of we're going to have long term inflation around 3 to 3.25, and that should be the new metric the Federal Reserve tries to achieve. But I also think that even with inflation at that rate, there's room. Once I think we potentially can have another 25 basis point adjustment on the upside from the Federal Reserve, we should see in 12 to 15 months from now interest rates coming down slightly. And I think the reason, when you simply look at long-term rates in the bond market, we're just not seeing long-term rates that have caught to short-term rates. So I think that's a pretty good indication of what's going to happen. You also asked the question, and I apologize for spending so much time on the interest rate discussion.
No, I think it's an important factor too.
Yeah, so I think it's a good backdrop.